Welcome to our discussion on open systems theory and transformations from Daniel Katz and Robert Kahn. Daniel Katz was born July 1903 and lived until February 1998. He was an American psychologist and an emeritus professor in psychology at University of Michigan. He was an expert on organizational psychology, and his research included open system methodologies, stereotypes, attitude change, morale, and motivation in organizational settings. Robert Kahn was born in 1918, and he was an American psychologist and social scientist. He was a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, and he was an expert on organizational theory and survey research. His research includes open systems, methodologies, organizational research, leadership, role behavior, and organizational effectiveness. This slide will demonstrate how open systems have evolved over the years. Initially, we had scientific and administrative management, Taylor, Fayol, and Weber, behavioralist and human relations, Bernard, Maslow, and Mayo, and natural systems by Blau, Scott, and Selznick, structuralist, contingency, and complexity theorists, Lawrence, Kaufman, and Levy, and general systems theory by Bertalanffy, Boulding, and Scott. All of these individuals informed Katz and Kahn in their development of their own theory that builds on general systems theory. The key concept behind open systems theory was that the open systems approach was developed in order to deal with the inadequacies in previous models. The commonly accepted open systems definition says a system is an assemblage of things or parts which form a complex or unitary whole. The critical element of an open system is the relationship between and the interdependence of the parts upon one another. So you can see from this picture that the system itself exists, and around that system exists a boundary that helps inform that system and allows the system to adapt and change. Katz and Kahn believed in the social organization as an open system. They extended and transformed thinking about open systems to organizational management and practice. They wrote a book called Social Psychology of Organizations in 1966, and in that book, the focus was to understand human and/or social organizations and describe what is essential in their form, aspects, and functions. And their purpose in doing that was to predict organizational effects and effectiveness. Their model was built on this idea of an energetic input-output where the energy coming from the output reactivates the system as feedback. In short, it means an interaction with the environment itself. Closed systems did not include any kind of interaction with the environment. That was ignored in those theorists. Now it's these theorists, Katz and Kahn, believe that social organizations are open systems due to their material exchanges with the environment, and that they could not avoid those types of exchanges. Organizations consisted of patterns of behavior, events that are and independent events that are cyclical and consistent over time. They introduced this input, throughput, output feedback model for organizational environments. And this model, as the foundational pieces, had four areas. One was inputs, which they also were called importation of energy from the environment. So anything that fed the system, such as resources or people. And then there was the idea of throughput, which is what you do to transform the resources. So an organization has inputs. They could be material resources, they could be people, they could be ideas. And then whatever the organization does with those is considered a throughput. And then ultimately there is an output. It's very obvious in a manufacturing organization that the output might be a car. But in a service organization or a community college, the output might be a graduated student. A student comes in as an input and they leave as a graduated student. And the feedback loop is behind the scenes, allowing the system to get feedback on a continuous basis and allows them to change. So you can see by this picture that the environment is always impacting the system through different mechanisms of input, throughput, output, and feedback. Other supporting characteristics of this model include systems as cycles of events. So what this would mean is that in our environments in colleges, we have terms or semesters that repeat over and over, and those cycles year after year repeat. So we have knowledge of what to expect. We also have historical information on how many students might be coming as resources. Negative entropy is that everything works toward deterioration. And so that would be that all systems, devolve over time. And so the system itself has to have a method by which to deal with that desire by the system to deteriorate. So that would be the information input, negative feedback, and coding process. So what that does is it allows the system to get feedback and to process that information, and then to have a method to categorize or collect that. That would be the coding process, and then deal with it as a way to deal with negative entropy. And then ultimately, the last item here, the steady state and dynamic homeostasis, is so that you take all that information, and because there's a tendency towards the system not only to deteriorate, but it has a desire to grow and ensure its own survival. So you need to address the negative entropy, whether it's feedback, information input, whatever it is that you're getting. It could be a change in funding, and you have to address it to preserve the character of the system and achieve a steady state. So for example, if you lost funding, you would need to probably replace that funding, or you'd have to cut a service. That would be an example of a steady state and dynamic homeostasis. Here are some additional supporting characteristics. The idea of differentiation and specialization. Open systems move in the direction of differentiation, specialization, and elaboration, and utilize energy to encourage uniqueness of function. Now that's a lot of words, but essentially what it's saying is within our organization, so let's again use our colleges, we all have different roles and responsibilities, and there are large groups that do that. So we have instruction, we have student services, we have technology, and we have student systems that support all of that for the student. And so as these systems differentiate, it leads to this idea of elaboration, meaning that the system is better and it helps to grow the system. Additionally, those different groups need to be integrated and coordinated. So while we are different, we all have to come together on a single purpose. Perhaps it's our mission or a particular initiative. And so that would be an example of integration and coordination. And ultimately, the idea of equifinality is that systems can reach the same final state from differing initial conditions and by a variety of paths. So you should think of it as the fate of the system. Thus, you might start somewhere and there's no single best way to organize to get to your final destination. So this picture here of the train tracks is the idea that you will end up at your same destination irrespective of whatever the inputs are if the system is working well. Criticisms of the theory are that the theory does not specify when and how collaboration in an organization takes place. It also doesn't identify what to do when there are conflicts between internal and the external environment. It does not identify how to resolve situations where the system cannot achieve homeostasis. Now, the first three here are interesting in that what that leads me to believe is that the theory itself is not overly prescriptive. So for me, that doesn't bother me, but for some theorists, other theorists that are criticizing Katz and Kahn, they, I guess, are looking for more. But the idea is that this theory is not overly prescriptive. You have to let the system do what it does, and then you have to respond. And then that's going to take leadership from others to solve some of these problems. Furthermore, there are some other criticisms that not all individuals agree that organizational systems should be compared to organisms occurring in nature. And then there's a dichotomy between identification of strictly open or closed systems. And a lot of theorists believe that that systems are partially open or partially closed and not strictly one or the other. I tend to agree with this one, I will admit, because I think it's difficult to have a completely open environment. And then the last one, the theory fails to recognize or acknowledge that social organizations are contrived man-made systems. Thus, it can be established contrary to the typical biological life cycle pattern of birth, growth, maturity, and death. And I would kind of agree with this one in that it's true that organizational systems do not match up exactly with biological systems, but they do share many of these same characteristics, as research has shown. And this also relates to the bullet point here that not all individuals agree that organizational systems should be compared to organisms. I don't know that you're going to be able to get away from that criticism. The general application of the theory, however, has proceeded despite its criticisms, and the input, throughput, output feedback model allows social organizations to do the following: adapt to change, especially environment-induced change, achieve a state of homeostasis, consistency and survival of the organization, embrace feedback as a means to transform, and ultimately, as the theorists intended initially, to realize organizational effectiveness. So this other picture down here in the bottom right will help you understand that it's more of a interaction between the people, the process, the technology to have a social organization. Here is another view of a contemporary model for this theory, where there are environmental inputs on the left, economic, sociocultural, technological, political, or legal. They are transformed as part of the throughput process, and they are output into the environment as goods, services, money, satisfaction, and information. And more recently, you'll see that more and more items are output that are related to customer satisfaction and information. Application to higher education. I won't read all of these, but I wanted to go through a few of these as evidence that the model works and that it does deal with open systems as social organizations. So here are some examples. Leaders view organizations as contributing to and subject to economic, social, technical, and legal forces in the environment. So things we might see as evidence that this is happening, that President Obama is promoting community colleges. We're seeing free community colleges. We're also seeing growth of CTE programs, and how that demonstrates the characteristics of the model would be you see input, negative feedback. So you're hearing people are frustrated about the cost of colleges. You see differentiation between community colleges and universities, especially on this free community college, and then ultimately they're achieving a steady state and they're ending up getting the student to get a degree, which is the equifinality. Another example here would be recognition that surviving and thriving require everyone's effort, not just the leaders. So that's something that you would see that, like a college president, is terminated to make way for new leadership thinking and approaches. So that would be examples of the model through input, and negative feedback. Let's say the leader is not doing their job, or the community or the board doesn't like what they're doing, and then they hire somebody else, they get a new president. That would be the output, and that ultimately they have another leader. Lastly, an activity here, the ability of the organization to predict future actions or outcomes. Here's an activity that we need to do all the time. So each time, as an example, the economy declines, the community college enrollment increases, and more demand for our services. So this would be an impact from the environment. Funding or something else changes and allows, or the economy changes and it allows us as community colleges to serve the needs of the community better. That would be demonstrating input, throughput, output. A way to the coding process would be we look at historical norms, and then you would see the systems as cycles of events, because this has happened before and we know kind of what's going to happen. And then we also can differentiate ourselves from colleges as well that are not community level or don't have CTE programs. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion, and when you go into the discussion board in Canvas, here is your question. Think of a particular initiative at your college. Using the input, throughput, output, feedback model, pick from 1 to 3 of the characteristics of open systems and explain how these characteristics work together to promote organizational effectiveness for the initiative. And alternatively, if your initiative is failing, why is it failing? Thank you for your help, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.